And I see that NBC News, August 8th of last year, I'm only going to read one of the line. Russians tried to hack Minnesota's political system in 2016, but millions in federal funds to bolster its defenses are unused because of a political feud. Is that a fair summarization?
That's an absolute fair summary, yes. And again, I keep getting back to this. It is a really dangerous game. We've needed this money for a long time. There's one big
Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon joins Tim O'Brien on this edition of Democratic Visions. Here's Tim.
Steve Simon is our Minnesota Secretary of State. Before that, he was a citizen legislator, and before that, he worked in the State Attorney General's office. Steve is a multifaceted individual, and we are very, very pleased to have him here today because the legislature's in session, and when the legislature's in session, nothing's safe. That's at least my theory. So Steve, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So Steve, we're going to focus in on election law. I think you've coined the expression investing in democracy.
Yes.
As it relates to what you're trying to accomplish and what you have accomplished in your term and a half now as Secretary of State. Tell me, what are the keynotes of that particular policy?
Yeah, well, investing democracy is a very Minnesota thing. It's a real Minnesota value because we value democracy here. And your viewers may know, but even if they do, it's worth repeating, Minnesota has an outstanding record when it comes to democracy. For the last 2 elections in a row, I'm proud to say Minnesota was #1 in the country.
And isn't it true that up to that time Minnesota had slipped to 4th or 5th or 6th?
6th.
Oh my
I'm afraid to report. So when I
gosh.
came in 2014, we were 6th. Nothing wrong with 6. If you're grading on a curve, 6 out of 50, quite decent. But I knew that we could get back to #1, and that was the challenge I issued going into the first election that I helped administer in 2016, and we got there.
Well, how did you do that?
Well, it's certainly a group effort and a team effort. We worked with thousands of partners, individuals, organizations, sports teams, high schools, colleges, you name it, and we tried to do some innovative things. We tried to mix it up. Obviously, we don't own it alone. It belongs to a lot of people, but we played, I think, a very meaningful role in getting us back to #1. And by the way, I will say, as you know, Tim, whether it's in business or sports or academics, the only thing tougher than getting to #1 is staying #1. And so the pressure was on in 2018, and guess what? We repeated. So now the pressure's really on. Looking ahead to 2020, we want to do the proverbial three-peat and get back there a 3rd time in a row. But seriously, I think a few things. We shored up some of the good laws that we have in the legislature. That's one thing. We sort of tried, at least around the edges, to do what we could around the culture of voting in Minnesota, particularly among new Americans and among our youngest voters as well. And then the 3rd thing I would say is we really tried hard and succeeded, I believe, in shoring up overall confidence in the system. I think there's no question about it. Minnesotans now, and for a while, have had a lot of fundamental confidence in the integrity of our election system. And the way we know that is people vote in very high numbers. They wouldn't bother to vote in such high numbers if they didn't think that at a basic level it was an honest system of integrity that is run and run well. I think if they thought it was otherwise, they wouldn't bother showing up, but they do.
Steve, it's vital that we have the federal funds to make sure that we have fair elections going forward. What are the prospects of that actually being available to you?
Well, let me back up a little bit or zoom out and talk a little bit about why we're even having this discussion.
Okay.
In 2016, Minnesota was one of 21 states whose election system was targeted by the Russian government, period. That's a fact. That's not debatable. We know that. It's conclusive from the federal intelligence authorities. They speak with one voice. So the good news in Minnesota is that we passed that test. No one got in, which is great. But as a result of what went on in 2016, the federal government, to its credit, acted last year. And Congress passed and the president signed some legislation to make available to all the states a total of hundreds of millions of dollars for election security. Our share of that was $6.6 million.
Seems like a reasonable sum.
Seems like a reasonable sum, and you'd think it would be a slam dunk, right? Well, in most states, 45 states to be exact, that's the end of the story. It's a pipeline directly from the federal government right to the Secretary of State's office. But in Minnesota and a few other states, there's an extra step. And the extra step is a state law that requires the state legislature to sign off on or authorize the use of that money. Even though it's not their money, it's federal money, they've got to give us the permission slip to use it. Now, the good news in Minnesota is nobody got in, so our systems worked, and that's great. But there were 2 states that were in a very different situation. In Illinois and in Arizona, somebody did get in, and they managed to try to make a little mischief in those states. So that didn't happen to us. So in the interim, since the end of last session to now, we didn't sulk, we didn't mope. Instead, we got a bunch of people together, legislators and staff from all 4 legislative caucuses, people from all levels of government, cities, townships, counties, IT experts, you name it. Got them into a room. We met several times over several months, and we came up with a plan, a blueprint, a roadmap for how to spend this money.
Is it primarily, the planned expenditure, is it primarily then on election security?
Yes, it is. It can be as easy as certain software and hardware. It can be as complex as recoding or resecuring existing databases. That's getting a little technical, but that's a huge need. Anyway, we came up with this plan. It was done by late November, early December on the desks of legislators.
I suspect this was a nonpartisan effort to pull this together?
You would think so. And there were noises in that direction from both legislative leaders, Democratic Speaker of the House Melissa Hortman, Republican Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka, both said leading up to and at the beginning of the session, this is a no-brainer, this is low-hanging fruit, this is something we can all agree on early, but guess what? As of this broadcast, we are still waiting for authorization to get that money.
You gotta be kidding me.
No.
What?
No.
What's going on?
And here's the rub too. In the House, they passed 100% authorization to our office so we can get going now on these really vital projects. 100% authorization, overwhelming and bipartisan vote, like 105 votes out of 134. I mean, overwhelming. In the Senate, they did not do that. In the Senate, they passed a bill saying, well, we'll give you about 20% authorization, and we don't know what they're going to do with the rest. We've asked them to tell us. Is there something about the plan you don't like?
Right.
Is there something about the process you don't like? What is it? And I got to tell you, as we sit here today, it looks just like tired and dangerous political gamesmanship. And so the people who are suffering are the voters of Minnesota, because I will tell you this, and I don't mean to get all cloak and dagger on you or your viewers, but one of the things that the intelligence community has done is they've allowed all secretaries of state plus 2 people in their office to get a federal security clearance so we can get intelligence briefings. The last briefing that I and my staff had was in Washington, D.C. about 5-6 weeks ago. And what I can tell you about that briefing is it was sobering. And what they have said publicly, which is what I can repeat on this broadcast, is expect more of this stuff, meaning potential ways in or people trying to break into the system. Expect more of it and expect it from more sources, not just the one government, not even just governments alone, but others.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. So here we have the intelligence community speaking with one voice, multiple agencies telling us over and over again, this is coming, it is real, it is accelerating. Minnesota is now, get this, the only state in the country, the only state without all of its election security money. So, ask yourself this question. If you're a wrongdoer or a mischief maker or a foreign government who's adverse to us out there,
I think I can answer your question.
Where might you consider starting?
Exactly.
I don't want to invite this, but let's just use our common sense. Do you think you might consider starting in one of the 49 states that has had its money for close to a year? Or might you consider starting your efforts in the one state that you know has not gotten its federal security money yet? I know what most people's answer will be. I'm not inviting that, obviously, but this is a really dangerous game, and we got to resolve it quickly.
Now, just for our viewers, I pulled some information online, and I see that NBC News, August 8th of last year, had why one state targeted by Russia can't use its federal election security funds. I'm only going to read one of the line. Russians tried to hack Minnesota's political system in 2016, but millions in federal funds to bolster its defenses are unused because of a political feud. Is that a fair summarization?
That's an absolute fair summary, yes. And again, I keep getting back to this. It is a really dangerous game. We've needed this money for a long time. There's one big project in particular that is a 4-year project. It's not like switching on a light switch. We need to get going on it now. And it's related to one of the chief vulnerabilities that may be out there. And so a lot of the items on this list, this plan that we've developed to spend the money, again, made in consultation with experts, with people from all over the state, with people from multiple political parties, many of the items on this list are not items we just came up with. They're items recommended to us by federal election security experts and by intelligence officials in Washington who came out physically to our office, poked and pried and probed and tried to find vulnerabilities, and issued to us their recommendations for what we needed to do to make our system even safer. This is their recommendations, and we can't spend penny number one on it unless and until the legislature, particularly the Senate, gets its act together and gets us that authorization.
Okay, I have a follow-up question to that, Steve, if you don't mind. I'm reading from some of my notes that on February 28th, the state Senate authorized the use of a fraction of that money.
Right.
Is that actually been put into law, or is it just sort of proposal on their part?
So they passed the bill off the Senate floor, giving us about 20% of the money, and the rest, who knows?
Limbo.
It's in limbo. So as we're taping this right now, there's a conference committee going on. That's what happens when the House passes one bill and the Senate passes a different version of the same bill, and they're supposed to get together and reconcile it. But as of right now, the Senate is obstinate and stubborn and unyielding in saying that it is unwilling to authorize the release or the use of anything more than about 20% of the number. And I have to tell you, doing that is kind of like buying a car without locks. You got this great car, and it may be wonderful, but you don't have any of the resources you need to protect the car that you just got. That's what they're doing, and it's really dangerous. I will tell you, the intelligence community couldn't be more sober and serious about this. They have warned us this is coming. They have warned us in particular about what potential vulnerabilities are. And so there is no good reason to hold up this money. And if it's part of some end of the session trade, if it's a chess piece in an end of the session trade, again, it's a dangerous, dangerous game that they're playing, and one they shouldn't play. And stay tuned. There's going to be more coming on that. But I'm to say I'm disappointed is to put it mildly. But we'll see what happens.
One of the main emphasis on your position is to ensure this kind of security, and maybe one hand tied or maybe two hands tied behind your back.
And the good news is some of the fundamentals are in our favor. We're a paper ballot state, right? Hard to hack paper. So in terms of mischief at the polling place itself, I'm a little less concerned about that. But we still have vulnerabilities, there's no question. And we have to address those. We have to do it very, very quickly. Keep in mind, and your viewers should recall that our next big statewide election is actually coming up in March of 2020. We have a presidential primary coming up on March 3rd, which is Super Tuesday of 2020, less than a year from now, and we got to be as ready as we can possibly be. And that means spending this money the way it was intended by President Trump, by Congress, when they appropriated this money for us, which is get your systems in order and get ready for any possible attack or attempted attack.
One last question on this, Steve. Let's assume that someone sees the light of day and this money is authorized. Is there time enough to spend it before that election in March?
There is time enough to make a lot of progress on the things we need to do before March, but not everything can be done completely before March. As I think I mentioned, one of the main projects here is a 4-year project. Now, it's not a question of flipping a light switch at the end of 4 years. It'll be rolled out in pieces, and some of those pieces can be done before March. But we needed that money yesterday. We should have had it last year. And to be the only state in the country that doesn't have that election security money is really reckless. It's really dangerous. And we're trying to make them understand that. And the glass half full side of me says that they'll see the light and we'll get a substantial piece of that money. We should get all of it, but we'll see what happens.
So that's one of the, as I understand it, 4 key components to your agenda dealing with investing in democracy. What's another?
Well, another, which I just touched on, has to do with that March presidential primary. Your viewers may remember that a couple years ago, in 2016, the legislature decided that in 2020, the way that we select delegates to national conventions in the Democratic race and the Republican race will be done not through a caucus system, which has been our tradition.
Not through a caucus?
Not through a caucus.
People are going to roll over in their grave.
Well, but we'll be a hybrid state. So we're keeping caucuses for everything else, for platform issues, for every other office, for Secretary of State, for legislators, for governor, but just for president and just every 4 years, it's going to be taken out and run separately as a primary, as a separate real election.
Binding primary.
A binding primary with real polling places and election judges where the government will take over that function.
I imagine that the turnout will go through the roof.
It could be through the roof, except that there's one part of it which the legislature really, really needs to change. And here's what it is. When it was passed in 2016, the legislature wrote into the law, unfortunately, a provision which says that when you go into that polling place on March 3rd, or if you have the ballot mailed to you, you're going to have to choose a party. You're going to have to pick a political party whose ballot you want to vote. And which party you choose will be a public record. So if you walk into a polling place and you have a Republican ballot and a DFL ballot, you're going to have to tell the election judge, give me that one or that one, and there will be a public record of which one you chose. Now, they won't know who you voted for, but they'll know which party's slate of candidates you chose to vote for. Now, Tim, We have never had, in the history of Minnesota, partisan party registration. This is a backdoor party registration.
So Steve, I just can't stand
Yeah.
it. What was the motivation behind that kind of legislation going through?
Well, I think there were some people at the time who felt that since this is the state or the government taking over what is in essence a party function,
Yeah.
that it should be public, like most things should be transparent and public. But I've got to tell you, and I'm sure your viewers agree, I have encountered a lot of people since that law was passed who said and say to me, look, I do not want to wear my party affiliation on my sleeve. I'm not interested in being a party registration type state. And I would say, Tim, this is even worse than party registration, because at least in states where you register by party, there's always an option to register as independent or unaffiliated. Here, if you want to vote at all, you got to pick a team and pick a side, and that will follow you. People do not want their neighbors, their employers, others to be able to look up a list of who all the Democrats and Republicans are.
Right.
And think about this. People in certain professions, journalism, judges, school administrators, and others who say, by virtue of what I do for a living,
Doctor, lawyer, Indian chief.
Anything, that they just don't want to wear that on their sleeve or be public about that. So I'm concerned that if the legislature fails to act and sticks with the law as written, we might see a decline in turnout or dampened enthusiasm, because there are many people who have said, look, I'd love to vote in the Democratic Party presidential primary or the Republican Party presidential primary, but I'm not interested in having my neighbor or my employer track my party affiliation. So stay tuned. I think there's an appetite to do this. I hope there is. I think more in the House than in the Senate, but we've got to keep pushing, because people do not want in this state a backdoor party registration system. It's about voter privacy and ultimately voter integrity.
Steve, you're in the know. This is your business. You know the ins and outs of that. I would venture to say that the average citizen is completely unaware of the fact that they are going to have to disclose their affiliation in order to get a ballot for the next year's presidential primary. There's going to be literally a real outcry, I suspect.
I agree. And I have been sounding that alarm and banging on that drum for a long time.
So what can be done?
What can be done is contact your legislator and let them know this is a priority, that this is important. It's a small fix.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a few words. That's it. That's it. Not complicated at all. But there's good news. It's making its way through the House. I think there's a
legislature to that effect.
Right, exactly. And hopefully we can persuade the Senate as well. I think this is a no-brainer. People aren't going to like this, and they're going to take it out on their legislators if they know that their legislators had a chance to fix this and actively declined to do that. So stay tuned.
Okay, I know that a third ingredient, and if I'm overstating what you're proposing, let me know, but I think that you want to decrease barriers to registration and talk about automatic voter registration. Is that something that you envision coming together in before any particular period of time?
I think we're making great strides, and there's great momentum for this.
Is it a partisan issue?
It really doesn't need to be and shouldn't be, because many states have now adopted it. I think we're up to a dozen or 14 states, some very red states, some very blue states. And I just want to sort of talk about this in a more approachable way, which is that this term automatic voter registration, it's snappy, all the rest, but really in a sense, it's a less sweeping reform than the name suggests. And here's what I mean, and your viewers probably know this. Right now when you go in and get or renew a driver's license, you do all the stuff, you take the eye chart test, and if you've ever noticed, on the form there's a box you can check. Right now, this is current law.
Okay.
It's a motor voter law that says, check this box if you also want this same information to register you to vote, because it's the same info.
Makes sense.
It's an opt-in system.
Sure.
All that automatic voter registration means is we're changing it to an opt-out system. So now you go in and take the eye chart test, and same form, same box, but now it says, hey, check here if you don't want to be registered to vote. It's great. So steps, I shouldn't say A through Z, but B through Z are exactly the same. It changes nothing about our system. It's just on the front end, that very first A step in the A through Z, that's changing the presumption. Everything else, all the filtering, screening, real human beings looking at this stuff, nothing's changed. And in the states that have done it, it's been great. Many more people on the voter rolls, cleaner, more accurate voter rolls, and we can get away from some of the petty political battles that we've waged over the last few years in Minnesota and elsewhere. I think it's a winner. I think voters are going to really like it. I think it's going to make our election system better. We need to persuade a few people at the legislature, but we're on our way certainly in the House, less certain in the Senate. But I think over time, people are going to come to see this for what it is, a great way to clean up the election rolls, make the voting experience even better than it is right now in #1 Minnesota. And that's a good thing. So I'm a long-term optimist on this issue.
What about a variation of that, Steve, where as soon as you turn age that would enable you to vote, you're automatically put on the roster?
So we also support something like that, which is called pre-registration.
Okay.
And a number of states, again, about a dozen or more states have this, where 16 and 17-year-olds who are not yet obviously eligible can pre-register to vote, which is just a fancy way of saying they give the information they're going to be giving anyway in a year or two about their name and their driver's license or social security information. And then once all the security checks check out, then boom, on their 18th birthday, they are automatically in the system. Again, it's worked wonders in other states. There have been studies from some of the states like Florida where it's really moved the needle on voter turnout, particularly among young people. And that's what we want. Even in number 1 Minnesota, there's room to improve. And we got to be in a constant process of continuous self-improvement, which we are.
Is there anything else that would enhance voter registration, or have we touched on the two that come to mind?
Well, those are the two that come to mind, but there's something else I'm thinking about in this list of investing in democracy that I think is really important, another idea whose time has come, and that is restoring the right to vote.
That's a major deal on my list here.
Restoring the right to vote for those who have left prison behind. It is time. It's really something, Tim, that many other states are marching towards. You look, I give this example, you'll get this as someone who follows politics. Florida, this last election, they had a recount in their governor's race. They had a recount in their U.S. Senate race. So this is a 50-50 state.
Right.
Yet they had a ballot measure about moving in the direction of restoring the right to vote for ex-felons. It got 61% of the vote.
Bipartisan support.
Huge, landslide support. In Iowa, the governor of Iowa just made this a centerpiece of her State of the State address. North Dakota has already passed a law doing that. So if North Dakota can do it, we can do it. And just for the sake of your viewers, the law in Minnesota right now is that you only get your right to vote back when you're done not only with prison, but you're done with the so-called on-paper part too. So if you're on supervised release or probation. The problem
Well,
with
that can extend for years, can't it?
Years. There was an article in the Star Tribune just a week or two ago about a woman who is, I think, 31 years old. She will have 40 more years of supervised release. She's out of prison. She's done her time. 40 more years for a drug crime. It wasn't even a violent crime. A drug crime. 40 years. She will be in her early 70s. That makes no sense. And I got to tell you, if someone's done their time and they're out and they're paying taxes and they're getting work,
law-abiding citizens.
They're law-abiding citizens doing everything we ask of them. Why shouldn't they be part of the team again? And by the way, even if you don't think for their sake they should be part of the team, for those of us who aren't felons, we should want this because from a self-interest standpoint, we don't want them to reoffend. And one way not to make someone reoffend is to make sure they know they're part of the team, they have a voice, they have a say in who governs them and how. And it's something we should do. There's a lot of momentum, true and deep bipartisan momentum here. There are liberal Democrats and several conservative Republicans who are really champions of this issue, so I'm quite optimistic. I think it's going to pass the House. It'll be on the Senate's doorstep, like a lot of other things, if you're noticing a pattern. So no guarantees about what happens in the Senate, but sometimes you just got to make some noise about these issues. You got to plant a flag and make sure, even if something doesn't happen this year, you got to talk about it, and you got to set the stage or set the table for future years. That's what's happening with this issue for sure.
I want to drill down a little bit on
Yeah.
that, Steve. Tell me how many Minnesotans fall into the category of having completed their sentence, whether they're in prison, jail, whatever, and now they're under probation. How many people are currently being deprived of the opportunity to vote?
Right. It's somewhere in the 50s, we think, somewhere in the mid-50s or so.
50,000.
50,000, right. And let me tell you something. The confusion leads to tragic results on both sides of the ledger. Every year there are a handful of people, and it really is just a handful or so, but still it's tragic, of people who are out of prison, mistakenly believe that they have the right to vote, and vote, and thereby commit a felony. It's tragic. It's horrible. There's confusion. Maybe they think we're like North Dakota or another state. Then, though, Tim, there are people on the other side who have a pretty tragic circumstance, not quite the same kind of tragedy, and here's what I mean. I know this from personal experience. I door knocked a lot when I was in the legislature for 10 years. I was kind of obsessed with it. Every single cycle. Yes, well, every single cycle. I would get someone at the door, they'd look at my lit piece, look at me, they'd say, hey, looks good, I wish I could vote for you. I can't, but if I could, and I would say, oh, why can't you vote for me? And they'd say something like, well, I committed a felony 20 years ago, and I'd say, oh, are you are you still on paper? And they'd say, no, I've been off paper for the last 10 years. And I'd say, wait a minute, you've been able to vote for 10 years. And they'd say, what? You're kidding me. I thought it was a lifetime ban. So there's confusion on both sides. And the best way to resolve that is a bright line rule. It's simple to administer, it's just, it's fair, it's right. And that is, if you're in prison, no, you cannot vote. But the minute you step out.
Actually, you can vote in 2 states.
In
can't
2
you?
states you can. You're right. You followed this. In Maine and Vermont, you still can vote in prison.
Yeah.
But what's being proposed in Minnesota is if you're in prison, nope. But the minute you step out, a judge or someone has determined you are good enough and safe enough and worthy enough, you're a safe enough bet to be out among the general population, you should be on the team and have a say in who governs you and how. If for no other reason, then that person then is much less likely to reoffend. It's an idea whose time has come.
But tell me on a national level, I mean, how many people are we talking about that have been currently deprived of their right to vote?
It's a lot. I mean, it's millions for sure. I mean, Florida alone, I thought I saw one statistic saying just in Florida alone, it's topping out at or near 1 million people who will be helped by what they did this last fall. And then you have 55,000 in Minnesota, you add it up, it's a lot. It's millions of people. And I think, again, there's real momentum here, genuine, broad, bipartisan momentum behind this idea. I think it's going to get done. It's a question of when.
Those of us who follow politics on a national level know about House Resolution number 1.
Yeah.
That was a key ingredient, was it not, restoring right to vote?
You know, H.R. 1, which was the very first act of the new democratically controlled House, I think is a fascinating piece of legislation. Just a few days ago, I did a joint event with Congressman Dean Phillips on that. He's been particularly passionate about it. If I can just say for a minute, toot our own horn here in Minnesota, a lot of what's in H.R. 1, well, a lot of what's in H.R. 1 is a list of stuff we're doing in Minnesota. So it's a list of best practices from around the country, and it's another example of Minnesota leading and showing the way when it comes to investing in democracy and having great democratic performance. Things like same-day voter registration, things like having paper ballots, things like having vigorous post-election audits for security and integrity purposes. So I think H.R. 1 is a great start in the sense that even though Mitch McConnell has said he's not going to hear it, that bill can be broken up into different parts, and they are popular. They're about cleaning up our campaign finance system, restoring confidence in our political system, about making it easier to vote. My MO, my mission in this office is exactly that. I've said it many times. My mission is to make it as easy as possible for every eligible Minnesotan to vote, period.
Once a person's completed his or her term, whether they're on probation or not, you espouse allowing those people to vote. Is that not correct? What about the fact that that seems to be running into a Republican headwind over in the state Senate?
Yeah.
They want to take another look at the length of probation. So they say, we'll keep maybe the same, but we'll see if we can tinker with the length that a person is otherwise deprived of voting. What do you think about that as a stopgap matter?
Well, you know, it's certainly better than nothing. And I think that's something that we should take a look at anyway. You know, I mentioned earlier this poor woman who, for a nonviolent drug offense, will have 40 years of supervised release. That's just unfounded. I mean, I don't know what the reason would be for that. And you know, our tradition in Minnesota for decades, under Democrats, under Republicans, has been to weight the sentences more on the non-prison part. So in Minnesota for crime X, whatever crime X is, just by way of an example, in Louisiana, let's say, the #1 state in terms of rate of incarceration, you might do 7 years in prison and 3 years on paper. In Minnesota, it might be the exact reverse. 3 years in prison, 7 on paper. So we have a lot more people who are walking around, not in prison, they've done their time, and yet can't vote. They can't do other things too, but they can't vote. And enough of that. I think Minnesotans are really embracing this idea of making sure that people, if you've done your time, have that right to vote restored, just like 61% of people in Florida, a 50-50 state, just agreed to do this last fall.
Steve, I opened up the program by describing that we're very fortunate to have somebody of your capabilities and hardworking on the team for Minnesota. I want to double down on that. You're the quintessential public official. Thanks for coming to Democratic Vision, Steve.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Democratic Visions is handcrafted by volunteers through Southwest Community Television and Bloomington Community Access Television. Democratic Visions can be seen on select cable access systems and on our YouTube channel. This is Carol Sundstrom.